Today, we're diving into a massive, trillion-dollar gamble that promised to completely reshape our world, China's Belt and Road Initiative. You know, it was sold as the project of the century, this grand plan to connect continents and lift entire nations out of poverty. But now, a decade later, you have to ask, was it a historic success or a global catastrophe?
You know, this quote right here, it just gets to the heart of the whole thing. The vision was incredible. They were promising these glittering new cities, bustling new trade hubs, but for so many of the countries that signed on, the reality turned out to be, well, pretty different. We're talking stories of unfinished projects and just crippling debt. So what on earth went wrong?
To really understand what was at stake, you have to wrap your head around the sheer scale of this ambition. We're talking about China pouring over $1 trillion into this thing, mostly as loans to developing nations. I mean, this is easily one of the largest infrastructure and investment projects in all of human history.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock a bit, back to 2013. When President Xi Jinping first announced the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, it really sounded like a game changer. The idea was to create a modern-day Silk Road, a huge, sprawling network of railways, highways, and ports connecting the entire globe.
The ambition here was just breathtaking. See, the goal wasn't just to pour concrete and build stuff. It was about rewriting the rules of global trade and putting China right at the center of it all. And look, for a lot of developing nations, this was an offer they just couldn't refuse. While Western institutions were often slow to invest, China was basically offering a fast track to development. And it worked. Over 150 countries signed up.
But was this grand vision really all about helping other nations? Well, as the project started getting underway, a completely different story began to emerge. The argument that started gaining ground was that behind all those promises of development was a hidden agenda, a really calculated strategy to serve China's own economic and geopolitical goals.
So here's how the strategy apparently worked. China had this huge surplus of steel, cement, and engineers, what experts call industrial overcapacity, left over from its own lightning-fast development. The BRI was the perfect way to offload it. The plan was pretty simple, really. Loan money to developing nations, but with one critical condition. The projects had to be built by Chinese companies using Chinese labor. This didn't just create jobs for China, it also massively expanded its global influence and promoted its own currency.
And that kind of self-serving strategy led right to the most controversial part of the whole BRI, a tactic that critics started calling debt trap diplomacy. The core accusation here is that these loans were basically designed from the very beginning to be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to ever pay back.
Right, so let's be really clear about what debt trap diplomacy actually means. The accusation isn't just about making some bad loans. It's the idea that China was deliberately targeting poorer nations with loans they knew these countries couldn't possibly repay. And the goal? Well, when these countries inevitably defaulted on the loans, China could then seize strategic assets. We're talking ports, railways, valuable land as payment.
And if you're looking for an example, Sri Lanka's Hambantota port has become the poster child for this whole strategy. So Sri Lanka was sold this dream of a new, bustling trade hub. They took out a massive loan from China. But the port, which, by the way, feasibility studies had warned was totally unnecessary, just failed to attract any ships. So, unable to repay the debt, Sri Lanka had no choice but to hand over the port and all its revenue to China on a 99-year lease.
And believe me, Sri Lanka is far from an isolated case. The BRI is absolutely littered with these so-called white elephant projects. You know, these are massive, super expensive ventures that look really impressive on paper, but in reality, they serve little to no purpose and fail to generate any real economic return.
I mean, take Montenegro, a small country over in Europe. Back in 2014, it took $1 billion loan from China to build a modern highway. The problem was, the project was so poorly planned that the money completely ran out after just one tiny section was finished.
That's right, $1 billion for just 41 kilometers of road that literally leads nowhere. And this single project has pushed Montenegro's national debt to over 80% of its GDP, forcing the country to go ask the European Union for bailouts.
And if we go back to Sri Lanka, not too far from that port we mentioned, another Chinese loan was used to fund the Matala Rajapaksa International Airport. It cost $200 million and attracted almost zero flights. It's now famous for being the world's emptiest airport, a place where wild elephants sometimes just wander out onto the tarmac.
And you know, these issues aren't just financial. They're about basic safety. In Ecuador, a $2.6 billion dam built by a Chinese contractor is now at risk of imminent collapse. And why? Well, according to reports, inspectors have found over 17,000 cracks in its walls because of shoddy construction. It's a potential human and environmental catastrophe just waiting to happen.
Or look at Pakistan, where the promise of prosperity from the China-Pakistan economic corridor has also come into question. Just look at the deal for the really strategic Gwadar port. A staggering 91% of all the revenue goes to the Chinese company operating it, leaving Pakistan with just 9%. I mean, it's a deal that critics say is just wildly lopsided. So, not surprisingly, the world really started to take notice of all this. That initial excitement for the Belt and Road Initiative has pretty much evaporated, and it's been replaced by widespread skepticism, and now countries are actually starting to push back.
And this pushback has been really significant. Italy, which was the only G7 nation to ever join, has now pulled out, with officials calling the decision a big mistake that brought them almost no economic benefits. Other nations, from Malaysia to Bangladesh, have canceled or scaled back projects because they're worried about the cost and about losing their sovereignty. And in Zambia, a major debt default in 2020 really highlighted the serious risks of taking on all that Chinese debt.
This growing skepticism has created a huge opening for the West. The US and Europe are now stepping in with their own rival initiatives, and their pitch is simple. We'll give you what China didn't. They're promising transparency, fairer loan terms, and a focus on sustainable projects. This is really setting the stage for a whole new era of competition in global development.
So after a decade and $1 trillion spent, how do we score this thing? Was the Belt and Road Initiative, this massive gamble, actually a success for China? Well, the answer, as it turns out, is pretty complicated.
Yeah, the final scorecard for China is definitely a mixed bag. On the failure side, its international reputation took a major hit. That debt-trap diplomat label has really stuck, and the growing list of failed projects has become a huge financial and political liability. But on the success side, China has made some major strategic gains. It's secured access to vital raw materials, it's expanded its geopolitical influence, and it now holds stakes in over 100 ports around the world. That creates a powerful network of trade and influence that simply didn't exist before.
But China isn't giving up. Nope. It's now trying to rebrand the whole thing as BRI 2.0. The new focus is supposed to address all the criticism, with new promises of greener, more sustainable, and digitally focused projects.
And that, right there, leads us to our final question. The world has been burned once by these grand promises that led to debt and disillusionment. So as China launches this new version of its grand plan, the real question is, will anyone be willing to buy the dream a second time?